The COP26 conversations are taking place in Glasgow, Scotland. And global leaders are gathered there, as they do. This is the 26th time that they're meeting to have this conversation organized by the United Nations to talk about what? Climate change and the impact of climate change and the mitigation measures that countries should take to avert a complete and total disaster. This year, UN Secretary General, in his opening remarks, said, you know what, this is the definitive year. If we do not take action this year, things will just go south. So, more than 100 leaders late on Monday pledged to halt and reverse deforestation and land degradation by the end of which decade? This decade, by 2030. Underpinned by a 19 billion shilling pledge in private and public funds to invest in protecting and restoring forests. The commitment, which was made at the COP26 climate talks in Glasgow, included countries such as Brazil, Indonesia, and the DRC, which collectively account for the majority of the world's tropical forests. While broadly welcomed, many conservationists have noted that similar zero deforestation pledges have repeatedly been made and not met by both governments and business. Those include the 2014 New York Declaration on Forests, the UN Sustainability Goals, and targets set by the global household brands. While the Glasgow Declaration has an impressive range of signatories from across forest-rich countries, large consumer markets, and financial centers, it nevertheless risks being a reiteration of previous failed commitments and if it lacks teeth. This is according to Joe Blackman, the head of forest policy and advocacy at London-based Global Witness. So many observers are saying, all right, yeah, we are seeing more and more pledges coming. So this one is a pledge on deforestation. India has made a pledge on what it needs to do to bring emissions to a certain percentage. The US has continued talking the way it talks. The UK has spoken. The Queen has sent a message to the global leaders and told them, guys, this time, can we be serious? They have said, yes, ma'am, we hear you. We're going to be very, very serious this time. Are we serious?
Of course we are.
On what?
In making pledges.
The thing is, pledges have to be made. Okay,
It's a starting point.
it is always a good starting point, and it is also a reference point to what ought to be done. Because in the absence of pledges, then what are you talking about?
It would be nice to have an audit, really, of the pledges. This is 26, right? It would be nice to have an audit of the pledges that have been done over the last, 2 decades or so, and then see how many of those pledges have actually been fulfilled. In the absence of that, what it is just, it seems to be another pledge-making soiree where everybody comes together and it sounds like the nice thing to say and say, oh,
Yes.
right, in the next 10 years, we also as a country have
Yes.
pledged to do 1, 2, or 3 or the other. And so you're rubbing shoulders with the world who's and makes it seem like the sexy thing to do at the moment. It's got to be more than that.
Campaign
Yes.
pledges.
I mean,
No.
Bottom
Look,
up.
it is a good thing for those pledges to be made. Remember that the presidents make the pledges, then they leave the bureaucrats to now work out the nuts and bolts of what it is they want to achieve. Now, the UN has had very many sittings to make decisions on how they can end wars in certain countries, how they can implement certain. My friend, this is the way that our world runs. There are always pledges, and then there's a whole list of things that ought to be done, and then every year you then report of a little movement that has been made forward. Then you also talk about how we haven't gained. Then how we talk about how we're on the precipice of absolute disaster as the human race. Those are our discussions. Now the discussions that I don't hear are, all right, good pledge, roadmap, good. But what can you actually do?
Or how can we hold you accountable? What do we do should you not meet what you've pledged?
That one, they will even write it down. And then, since the people who made the pledges are elected leaders of most countries, the next time you have that meeting, that person may not be president.
They'll be out of office.
Or they may not be prime minister. They may not be someone or the other.
But you see, it's not a leader that makes a pledge. It's a country that makes a pledge.
Actually, I wish to differ with you on that one, if I may. It's the leader who makes the pledge.
So we shouldn't be saying that India has made a pledge. We should be saying Narendra Modi has made a pledge.
On behalf of the government
That
of
is
India,
part of, that's why I'm bringing
on behalf of the people. But it is him who has made. For instance, why don't we look at a country like Brazil that actually is one of the biggest lungs that this particular planet has when it comes to what it does for us in terms of its forest cover. Did the president of Brazil, is he at the conference?
The pledges were made.
Precisely. He is visiting his ancestors' home somewhere, I think in Italy. And he has been known to be one of the people who has been at the forefront of clearing forests for farming. He's in for big farming. Him. That's what, when I say the president, I mean it is him.
So, the country of Brazil is among those that signed among this declaration for reforestation
Eric,
and preserving of forests.
Don't you see my point
by
here?
this decade?
Don't you see my point?
It is not Bolsonaro. It is Brazil.
Bolsonaro is the president. He will sign that agreement and then he'll continue clearing forests.
Let's bring in somebody to help us have this conversation. Melita Steele is the Interim Program Director for Greenpeace Africa. She joins us via video link from South Africa. Very good morning to you, Melita.
Hi, good morning. It's good to be here on the show with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So, Greenpeace has been one of the largest voices in the globe when it comes to issues of climate and climate change and how to preserve our environments. So, just from the reading of what you're seeing happening in Glasgow, what's your immediate reaction to what we see the global leaders saying, what they're committing to, what the pledges that they are now making?
I think as far as Greenpeace is concerned, this COP is a really good opportunity for world leaders and governments to actually show up when it comes to the climate crisis. There's a lot of conversation about the kinds of pledges that are being made, but there's real opportunity for progress at this COP, assuming that governments actually take the climate crisis seriously. We're only a few days into the COP, so it's really hard to really analyze in terms of whether we will actually make measurable progress. But I think the reality is that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their latest report this year, and they basically called it a code red for humanity. Humans are causing the climate crisis, and we're the only way to stop the climate crisis. And so pledges are not good enough at this stage. And we've been in a situation where pledges have been made before and then have not been followed through. So we're not really in a position to create incremental change. We really have to be taking big, bold steps that phase out fossil fuels very, very quickly, that end exploitation based on the colonial legacy on the African continent, both of our forests and our oceans. And we really have to see the commitment to renewable energy start to take steam.
Melita, why is COP26 an opportunity for these countries to show up as opposed to previous climate conferences? Why would this one specifically be the one where we are saying show up? Is it because the pledges that have been made previously are enough and it's time to see action? Or why this specific one?
So one of the important things about this COP is that countries are coming to them with their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which is basically each country's specific contribution to stopping the climate crisis. What we found is that those national contributions are inadequate. And so the COP is really a time when pressure can be applied to countries to actually step up what they're prepared to do domestically. It's also quite an important moment in terms of the kinds of money flows that need to happen to try and stop the climate crisis. So at the Paris Agreement in 2015, there was a commitment to $100 billion to go to less developed countries, and that has really not been followed through. So it's an important moment to take stock of what governments are currently committing to, but also recognizing the gap and the need for much more urgent action.
If I may ask, does Greenpeace is Greenpeace involved in the processes of monitoring the activities that countries around the world have taken to continue the process of increasing their forest cover or also reducing gas emissions? Do you keep tabs of countries that are in the process of either doing something positive about this or doing something negative about it?
Yes, so Greenpeace is a global environmental campaigning organization, and we have offices in at least 25 countries around the world. And each of these offices monitor their national governments, what is happening regionally. An example that I can give you is, you mentioned the deforestation pledge, that governments have committed to stop deforestation by 2030. The DRC was mentioned as one of the governments who signed on to that pledge. However, it's important to know that at the same time, the DRC government is talking about lifting a moratorium on logging concessions that has been in place since 2002. So we're tracking what the DRC government, what the Cameroon government are doing in terms of the Congo Basin. So on the one hand, signing a pledge to stop deforestation by 2030, and on the other hand, removing a moratorium that is really critical for protecting the forest.
Did you have examples of countries who have actually positively followed some of these pledges and have reduced just the high levels of gas emissions within their countries and have also increased their forest cover since the last COP?
It's really tricky to see significant progress on a sort of yearly basis based on commitments. One of the governments that has been taking a leading role, especially when the US stepped back from the Paris Agreement, is actually the Chinese government. And we've recently had an announcement from the Chinese government that they're no longer going to finance coal in other countries. They're also really ramping up their renewable energy investments. And that kind of declaration by a country like China can really change the playing field in terms of countries around the world that are looking to finance coal, of which China would have been a big financier, but now would need to start looking at actually the rapid phase out of fossil fuels instead.
One of the groups of people who have been reported to be at this particular conference in very large numbers are green financiers, insurance organizations that deal with green financing, understanding very clearly that an impact on the environment has a very direct impact on matters of finance. Now, when we say, for instance, that China has said it will no longer finance, that, in my opinion, is a good step. But what are they doing about the projects they've already financed? Because the ones which have already been financed and are ongoing are the ones which are contributing to this detrimental increment in gas emissions. So, are they reducing? Because not funding more brings us to a point where we are at a status quo. And the status quo is not good.
Absolutely. So I'd agree with that 100%. The challenge is that there are countries around the world, including countries in Africa, South Africa, Kenya itself, who are planning to build new coal-fired power stations. That is in the face of the climate science, which is incredibly clear that we cannot afford any new fossil fuels. So one step forward is to close the tap in terms of money for fossil fuel projects. Another step forward is for those governments that do have fossil fuels in their countries to start rapidly phasing out those fossil fuels. And the money flows are quite critical in terms of that. So in terms of do you have money to build the fossil fuel projects that you're already investing in? Is a big question. And do you have the money to phase out? So there's been quite a big agreement that was made recently, I think it was yesterday, between South Africa and a few European countries to actually help the country phase out of coal. So there's new investments in fossil fuels. There's existing fossil fuel projects under construction, and then there's the phase out. And you need to do a phase out from fossil fuels in a just transition. You need to be putting workers at the center, and we really need money flows to actually enable that, and we need governments who are firmly committed to action on the climate crisis.
Melita, when I hear these conversations about phasing out those that are already generating huge amounts of power using fossil fuel and stopping anybody else from even thinking and contemplating, I look at just unfairness in the world. This is completely wrong and immoral. Look, if a country is already using fossil fuel to generate power, and then you're talking about phasing out, you're not talking about phasing out in 2-3 years, you're talking about phasing out in decades. And then another country, small country that already has 80% of its power coming from renewable sources, and saying we want to have about 2% of our power, which 2% is a 0.0 something percent of the power in another big country, saying we'd like to come up with coal, and you say, don't even think about it. What's that? And yet, those countries are making those global pledges, saying, all right, so we're going to have, some funds that can help you develop in green energy. Those funds are not forthcoming. This is the big players trying to stop development in the undeveloped world.
I think it's really important to be looking at our pathway to energy independence and energy security, especially on the African continent. And we have some of the best renewable energy resources in the world on the African continent. Obviously, it differs from country to country. But really what we need is governments who are taking the climate crisis seriously, who are not waiting for money to appear out of nowhere, but are actually investing in clean renewable energies. And there are differentials between different countries, but the reality with the climate crisis is that it affects everyone. We're all on the front line. We're all already living with the impacts of the climate crisis.
That's agreed. So what is it that the big players are doing then to stop this fast enough? If you're talking about the big players who are using all these harmful means to produce their energy, committing to take 10, 15, 20 years to stop doing this, they own the technology that would help the smaller countries, the African countries, to develop their green energy. We want to develop green energy. We have vast resources in the country to tap the solar, to tap wind, to tap geothermal, but we don't own the technology. Those that own the technology are the polluters. How do we balance this out?
Actually, in my opinion, Eric, you know how it's balanced out. These so-called renewable energies, other countries can also invest in them. But the unfortunate thing is what we now call the great emitters of these gases. When you talk about, you're now talking about big business. You're talking about big industry. And to change is cost. Now, if you look at countries where they have perhaps reduced the usage of some of these fossil fuels, it's because the other technologies we refer to have also increased. So coal has become less competitive. So it isn't as though they suddenly decide they're going to drop. No. They have alternatives which work better, and coal is simply dropping in demand because there are other alternatives.
Yes.
Now, where I'm in full agreement with you is that this is not only unfair, it's hypocritical and it's nonsensical. Even if a country like Kenya were to use coal, it is a minuscule quantity in terms of what emissions it will produce compared to the people who actually are responsible for this discussion about greenhouse gases.
And who are still contributing using coal.
They still are. All they're saying is they're not increasing their production, and they're not investing in new. And there is talk of reduction. Now, that talk of reduction is talk.
We're also not taking into consideration how much of it was actually used to run entire economies for a very long period of time.
150 years.
And to develop to the level where they are at now,
Yes.
that they can even invest in developing new technologies for renewable energy.
They don't seem to think it's important for them to do that because this one already makes money. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that's one of the big debates in the COP negotiations. We've touched on a couple of things here. The one is the technology. So this is something that the African countries, other countries on the front lines of the climate crisis are really trying to negotiate hard in terms of releasing some of the patents and the technology around renewable energy. And that's a key area. The reality is that developed countries have developed on the back of fossil fuels. That's very clear. I mean, if you look at the historical responsibility for creating the climate crisis, that's on the back of the European Union, the US, those major developed countries that have fully exploited fossil fuels. However, even if we acknowledge that that is the reality, and we must acknowledge that people on the African continent do not bear the historical responsibility for causing the climate crisis. Nonetheless, we all need to make a fair contribution to stopping the climate crisis, and that's what's under debate. And so even if a coal-fired power station in Kenya, which is being proposed in Lamu, seems like a small contribution, you have to look at its contribution to the climate crisis. You also have to look at its contribution to pollution, damaging people's health. So there's a range of negative side effects from fossil fuels that every single fossil fuel project contributes to. And Greenpeace strongly believes that we have the resources in renewable energy. And it's absolutely possible for African countries to leapfrog over dirty development and into a cleaner future based on renewable energy.
We'd like to hear some of those ideas that Greenpeace has in the next half of the show. We are talking about the climate talks that are taking place in Glasgow, Scotland. World leaders, business leaders, and civil society organizations are gathered in Glasgow to talk about climate change. COP26 talks, pledges being made, progress being reviewed and audited, and then plans on what needs to happen. In the studio with you this morning is Eric Latif, Ndu Oko, and C.T. Muga. And joining us on the line is Melita Steele, the Interim Program Director for Greenpeace Africa. As we were taking the break, Melita, you said Greenpeace, for example, is really, really convinced that Africa, it's possible for Africa not to go the fossil fuel route, but to use renewable energy and leapfrog the developed world in terms of meeting its energy needs and also its development needs. What are some of those things that Africa could do?
Yeah, I think it's really important that the world cannot continue to consider Africa as the new frontier for extraction and exploitation. And as countries in the global north start shifting away from fossil fuels, that they start eyeing the African continent as a place of extraction. We have to actually find a way to undo the colonial legacy of exploitation on the continent. And one of the best ways to do that is actually to utilize what we have on the continent. And we're very lucky to have the kinds of renewable energy resources that we do have on the continent. And that ranges from solar to wind to geothermal to offshore wave energy. There are a number of different options around renewable energy that exist on the continent. And essentially what needs to happen is that we need to be harnessing the maximum potential of our renewable energy. We have significant problems when it comes to electricity access on the continent, just as a base bottom line. And in fact, the reality that renewable energy is decentralized means that it's actually much better suited to delivering electricity where it's needed, whether that's in urban areas or whether that's in more rural areas. And so we are seeing some governments starting to take up renewable energy as a really important element of their energy production. But it requires governments to fully get behind the potential of renewable energy and to invest heavily and support the uptake of renewable energy across the continent.
So what would this entail? I mean, all those things that you're talking about are things that I see being done across Africa. Use of renewable energy, just homes looking at how to use solar for basic energy needs. Countries investing in how to tap the renewable sources of energy, like you've said, solar, wind, and geothermal for the case of Kenya, for instance. But then all these things, as you say, require some kind of investment. So what is it that is hindering then the African countries from getting to invest in them? Is it not lack of the fact that you are not yet developed enough, so that if you dedicate a huge chunk of your budgets into this renewable energy where you don't own the technology, you're buying the technology, you're basically just shooting yourself in the foot?
I think a lot depends on how you structure your local renewable energy market. So we're definitely seeing, so I started working for Greenpeace in 2009. Renewable energy wasn't even something that people spoke about at that stage. So we're 12 years later, and renewable energy is something that people recognize, that they use if they can afford. But if you just look at your own home, the upfront costs in terms of investing in solar panels are quite significant.
Yes.
And so what we need is local banks to start coming to the party. I mean, you get a home loan. So there are multiple ways that local banks could be supporting renewable energy uptake much more significantly. Mm-hmm. And then basically we need to scale it up. So we don't just need investments in renewable energy at an individual level. We need the kinds of scaled up projects that can deliver to cities and to countries. And that requires commitment from the government, supportive structures in place, so an enabling marketplace or system, and also trade flows between countries. So renewable energy in one country can supply another country as well.
Which is where I'm bringing in the conversation about, in fact, you called it that colonial structure. So, for example, in this region, renewable energy, yes, has not been a buzzword, but our electricity has been renewable for the longest we can remember. We've been using hydro as our source of energy. Then we've gone into solar, we've gone into geothermal, we have wind power projects in the country. The issue, though, is on the ownership of technology, Melita. And this is why I'm just keep pushing back on that the owners of technology are developed, and they developed using fossil fuel. So yes, let's not look at their historical scenes. Let's see that they have acknowledged, and they are not stopping to use the dirty fuels. They're just committing to reduce the use of dirty fuel over the next couple of decades. And these African countries that have been at the forefront of championing and using renewable energy anyway don't have access to the technology. Should the conversation not be, as you say, you are pledging, you're doing A, B, C, D, make these patents available to these African countries so that they can develop? Should this not be the push that we get from organizations such as Greenpeace? Technology
is definitely one of the core issues in terms of the climate crisis. And these negotiations have been ongoing. This is the 26th year that these negotiations are happening. I think if you even just look at the COVID pandemic, the issues around patents are so much around profits over people. So even in the face of a global pandemic, releasing the patents to actually produce vaccines in countries where the vaccine was not developed seems impossible. So just because it seems impossible does not mean we shouldn't be pushing for it. We should absolutely be pushing for patents to be released, technology transfers to be enabled. We can also be pushing for local ownership as part of renewable energy, but you make sure that it's not just a project that is funded by a company in the EU, for example. But ideally, countries in Africa would be able to have access to the patents and be able to use that to deliver renewable energy technology at scale.
The negotiation of some of these things, I think, then, is what a lot of focus then needs to be. There seems to already be a set agenda upon which then people will focus. There's a set agenda upon then which the conversation will be had. Reduce here, argue on this particular point, have negotiations on this particular area, whereby the things that hurt everybody, at least in uniformity, for example, on the African continent, seems to take a back seat. So in terms of negotiation, shouldn't we have some more focus then when it comes to negotiation of some of these things? When we're talking about development, still in the face of climate change, and that development needs to happen. Some of the other countries that are part of this conversation, their development does not come to a standstill either. In fact, they're negotiating based on the fact that their development must continue, right? So should we not be talking about a more forceful negotiation on the part of African countries, for example, for whom are being asked to do certain things, almost traded for development?
Yeah, I think the power dynamics in the negotiations are really critical to reflect on. So there is a strong negotiating bloc in the COP negotiations, which is called the G77 in China. And that is African countries and the least developed countries as well, trying to negotiate as a bloc. But there is no doubt that the power and authority that a country like the US exerts in these kinds of international negotiations is significant. But we're starting to see the geopolitics start to change in terms of the red lines for countries who are facing the worst impacts of climate crisis. I think a lot of the problem is also on how technical these questions are. So, I mean, most people would not even have thought about the patents related to renewable energy. Never mind how can that be applied in your own country. People just want access to electricity. And so part of the problem with the negotiations is that they happen at a very high technical level, that people have a problem accessing what is really going on in the negotiations. And just to reflect on that, the deforestation pledge, in terms of how Greenpeace has looked at it, that seems like just another decade to allow deforestation to happen around the world. It's not enforceable. And so we're in a situation where the negotiations are technical, pledges are being made that are not enforceable and that are incremental. And so really what we need to see is people power, is people standing up and calling their governments to account and saying, we really cannot live with the climate crisis and we need urgent action domestically and internationally.
There's something that I find a little disturbing about this discussion on climate change, greenhouse gas emissions and so forth, and the discomfort is here. Every time a discussion of this nature is had, there are these aspirational perspectives that are always presented. This ought to happen. And yet, the key players in this discussion are never discussed. Big industry, big business. We talk about governments. Now, governments don't run coal factories. Governments don't run some of these huge industries that we are huge consumers of fossil fuels, The production of fossil fuel itself isn't something that is run by governments. It is private enterprise. Now, at what point are the people who are fundamentally responsible, because the government has policies, makes it possible for these people to do business. At what point are these key players ever involved in this discussion? Because so long as the key element in their perspective is how much money they will make for themselves and for the shareholders of whichever organization they have, the governments will make statements such as the one we're hearing in Glasgow. There'll be aspirations that organizations such as yours have, but I don't think we will make very much progress if the people who are at the heart of it are not involved. So how do you involve big business?
I think that ultimately big business are involved from the beginning. One of the biggest challenges is the very, very close relationship between government and big business. So even before a government would go to the COP negotiations, they would usually have some kind of stakeholder engagement nationally. And those national consultations are often including the biggest companies, the biggest energy users, the biggest fossil fuel companies. And what that means is that we often get to the lowest common denominator when it gets to the negotiations. In some cases, you even have representatives from fossil fuel corporations on national negotiating teams in the COP negotiations. So as far as Greenpeace is concerned, there's definitely no concern that business is being underrepresented in terms of this. What we would say is that, in fact, governments have such a close relationship to corporations and to the profit motive that they will usually go in the direction that companies, fossil fuel companies, forest exploitation companies, ocean exploitation companies want them to go in. And so, in fact, what's needed is a break, that we break that relationship between government and big business so that governments are more free to make commitments that are actually in the interest of the people in the countries that they live in. And it's actually time that big business exerted far less influence over the COP negotiations, and that government started to hold big business accountable for the kinds of shift in their business model that must align with 1.5 degrees global warming.
Melita, is there any monitoring framework that's in place for all these climate conversations to say that this is one organization that's under the auspices of the United Nations that does monitoring of what every country is doing? Like what we see with the nuclear arms conversations, there is the IEA, there is the non-test agency. Do we have something like this for nuclear, for climate?
I think the best thing that we have is the UN negotiations themselves, which keep track of the commitments that different countries have made. The other sort of international collaboration around climate is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what that is international climate scientists who are analyzing the data, looking at what governments are currently doing to try and map out different trajectories for us to go on. So I talked just now about a 1.5 degree alignment. So according to climate science, we really need to align with 1.5 degrees to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Mm-hmm. But there are other possibilities. We could land up with global warming that is 3 degrees, 5 degrees. And what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change does is they analyze those different trajectories and give us information based on the kinds of decisions that governments are making. What's clear at the moment is that we're not on a pathway to 1.5 degrees. So the kinds of commitments are inadequate.
Is there a case for establishment of an independent body that monitors not just the pledges, but the actual emissions per country? That says, so when every country comes and says, you know what, our emissions this year had come down to this and the other, and our contributions are going now to be reducing to this, and there's actually a body, an independent body, that monitors and gives a report and says, this country we have noticed this and the other either contributed directly or indirectly. And then looking against their own pledges at such talks and saying they pledged that by this time they ought to have been at this point, and indeed they are, or they have surpassed the target, or they have really fallen short of the target. In fact, we have noticed that they did not even make any move towards the target. Is there a case for such an organization?
I think there may be. I mean, there are definitely different ways of looking at measuring emissions, and I think we have a well-established framework that emissions are measured within. So we're clear about who the biggest emitters are and what their emissions are. But the challenges come in terms of reducing those emissions and measuring the reduction or increase. And I think that's where the reliance on national governments comes in. And there's definitely space to be looking at that with a much more critical eye, because we need to be reducing emissions and we need to be doing it quickly.
Do you realistically see a situation where we will live in a world that is actually run by renewable resources, and that they are dangerous gas emission free, and that people will actually get to a point where when they make commitments, they will actually live up to it? Do you foresee such a situation?
That kind of world is absolutely possible. So we're at a very important time right now where so much time has been lost debating, is the climate crisis real? Did humans create the climate crisis? And those questions are settled now, but we've wasted time actually getting there. There is no doubt that a combination of renewable energy and energy efficiency can power the world, can power the kinds of needs that we have globally. But it's a global effort. So it doesn't help if, Germany decides to go 100% renewable energy and countries like Nigeria or the US remain heavily invested in fossil fuels. We all need to be looking at this as a collective crisis that can affect us in a range of ways. So, we haven't really talked about the impacts of climate change. But just in Kenya itself, you've got a really significant drought that's happening at the moment. Food security starts to come into risk. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report indicated that sea level rise might be actually worse than already predicted. Agricultural zones are changing due to the climate crisis. So we're in it. We're living with the reality of the climate crisis right now. And what that means is that we collectively need to recognize that every single government, every single business, every single person needs to be taking the climate crisis seriously and acting to create that kind of future. And if we do, it's absolutely achievable. But I think the point that was made about how we don't have time to waste is really, really important. This is not something that we want our children or our grandchildren to be living with, because the world will become uninhabitable. We really need to strive for a renewable energy-based future.
Melita, we thank you very much for speaking to us. Melita Steele is the Interim Program Director at Greenpeace Africa.